Hello and welcome to this video on metadata and biases. So today I'm going to cover 4 topics, and they are these. Number 1, what is metadata? I will be using an extended metaphor. I hope you enjoy. Number 2 is how does metadata affect data collection? Number 3 will be how does metadata affect data retrieval from like a database, right? And finally, we'll talk about number 4, intrinsic and explicit biases when it comes to metadata. Okay, so first of all, let's pretend that I have a wonderful collection of cardboard boxes. I am hiring you to help me categorize these and tag them so that I can go back and retrieve any one box that I'm looking for just by a description of it. Okay. We'll call this group of boxes my collection, okay? So the question becomes, how do we tag this so that I can retrieve it by general size, by dimensions, by shape, whatever. And we'll call that process cataloging, okay? So let's start off by imagining what a person might be looking for. You know, rectangular, square, octagonal, can you call that a box? Tube boxes? So make a little list in your mind of different traits or descriptors that you might use, okay? Perhaps we're going to look at corrugated versus not. This corrugation is quite thick. Maybe we'll even measure it. How about flaps? Size of flaps? Tape? The kinds of tape and the color of tape, maybe? This one has a shipping label on it still, mint condition. Some handwritten information here, as well as printed numbers and logos and icons, right? So, if we start with this as our, first box of the collection, we have some traits already that we might be interested in, okay? Let's take a look at the second box. We've got an Amazon box, which you can tell by the beautiful Amazon tape, as well as the Smile logo. You might also consider some wear and tear, as this is bowing out a little. It's not in great shape, not exactly mint, but it's still fits within our parameters. You can say it has corrugation or not. We have some printing on the back of it. You also might want to decide how you would label each side, which can be very tricky. But you might want to distinguish, for example, a smile on the smaller side versus a longer side, but also what happens when you have a square box, right? So, what happens when we have a box with no flaps? Does this still count as a box functionally? Or is the box only something that has, a closing aspect to it? Does it have to have all 6 sides, right? Or does this still count? Many questions. These have got a different type of tape on there, different kind of packing tape. But when you start asking what is a box functionally, then, you're on the right track. Alright, so these are all kind of metaphorical properties that you'd be considering for your collection, right? So whether these boxes end up being journal articles, photographs, maps, personal reports, oral histories, whatever it is. It's important to try and imagine the scope of this project in its lifetime, right? So did anyone think, for example, of adding in the property of cardboard or brown, right? I like to think that if librarians had any wit when we had made all these classification systems, we would have had a field for what color the cover is and what color has the cover previously been, and that would help us, find a lot of books, basically. But so that's a little bit about what metadata could be. Okay, so we move on to point number 2. How does metadata affect data collection? Hopefully you're already churning it around in your brain, but in our cardboard box example, there were a lot of parameters that we could have chosen to use, right? So maybe overall size, possibly judging by weight, corrugated or not. General depth of corrugation, things like that, writing on it. So when you're out collecting this data or describing data, then you have to be just as considerate of the properties of that data as you would be when you're taking care of my beautiful extensive box collection. So There are some properties that you want to consider for things like photographs. So estimated dates are just a huge pain, right? You have to consider the system that you're building, whether or not it'll be smart enough to recognize an estimated date range of 1800 to 1810 that will return a result if someone searches for 1809, right? For things like oral histories, you might consider the language that's being spoken, the names of both the interviewer and the subject rather than just the subject, because, you know, the interviewer might get famous someday, or a descendant might wish to hear their voice. Right? So things that you kind of tend to take for granted sometimes have to be really carefully considered in the context of a collection. Okay? And that's because point number 3, how does metadata affect data retrieval? It's a great question. So if you don't have a standardized, agreed upon system or a vocabulary for your collection, you're never going to be able to retrieve your information reliably, right? So consider if someone decided to put oral history language down as English, and then another person picked ENG, and then another person picked EN, you're going to have a bad time, right? Same for unit of measurement, for example. Pounds versus kilos versus grams, right? They're all going to give you very different impressions, okay? Most databases are really not good at natural language processing, so synonyms are going to be really hard for them. And that's up to the point where there exists something called the Library of Congress Subject Headings System. So this kind of standardizes the language used in libraries specifically. So this is how you'll know that your search for Shakespeare, William, if you use Shakespeare, William, 1564 to 1616, you should always bring up the same William Shakespeare, right? So just imagine if every single library system had done something different, right? Whether it was just William Shakespeare instead of Shakespeare, William, or Will Shakespeare, it's a little casual, or the date of death instead of, the range of the lifetime. All of that will affect how a database can retrieve that information, right? So, how might data, metadata be affected by biases is number 4, okay? So point number 1 is the exclusionary nature of giving a physical item only one physical location that's tied to a category. So imagine you have a book in front of you and it's called Buddhism and Politics in 20th Century Asia. So do you classify that as religion, because it's Buddhism, politics, because it says politics, history, because it's history, it's up in the air, right? If you ask an Asian person, they might categorize Buddhism as philosophy, right? There's not as much of a distinction in a lot of non-Western cultures for things that are cleanly delineated. So digital items have less of an issue with this, but if you are going to be cataloging physical CD backups of oral histories, stable copies of digital media, you might encounter this issue. So selecting only one area kind of prefers it to the others, right? So the second point to bias is that when I asked if you considered adding cardboard as the material type, I was kind of asking a little bit about what you consider the default to be, right? So there's a troubling bias issue in librarianship and elsewhere, but when we use a Western perspective to catalog an item, we necessarily make a non-Western item harder to find because it doesn't cleanly fall into our neat little categories the way that we perceive the world, right? So in addition, there are historically gendered terms that have their own biases. So when you see vocabulary that says astronaut and then female astronaut, then the male is the default, right? When you see nurse and male nurse, then female is the default, right? If you were to decide that certain categories were not necessary at all, like transgender nurse or queer identifying nurse, then how is anyone going to find those categories, right? So the third and final thing will be explicit bias. So Library of Congress subject headings include, by an act of Congress, the term illegal alien. That is the preferred term. So if you put in undocumented, the only things that come up are illegal aliens, women illegal aliens, and illegal alien children. So it's a little bit problematic and not great. So when you're thinking about metadata, the whole goal of it is going to be to try and think ahead and consider how people are going to be searching for things and finding things in your system, what types of things will be included in the longer term, and how you can describe things consistently and with as little bias as possible, right? No bias is impossible because we are all human and we all make really, mean names for each other. And that's kind of in our nature. So that is the little talk about metadata and bias. I hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.